Episode 1, The Whisper Beneath the Confessional. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It fell against the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Church like 1,000 restless fingers, drumming to be let in. Father Elias sat in the confessional, the scent of damp wood and candle wax clinging to his robe. He had fallen asleep somewhere between the 6th and 7th prayer until a voice woke him. "My sin," the voice said, trembling. It was murder. Elias straightened, his heartbeat echoing inside the wooden booth. He hadn't heard the door open, nor the creak of footsteps across the old stone floor. The voice was close, too close, like a whisper pressed against his ear from the other side of the screen. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. A pause. Then the voice broke, wet and shaking. "I buried her, beneath the church." Elias froze. His breath fogged the air. "Whom did you bury?" "My daughter," the whisper replied. "And she still moves." The confessional went silent. The candles outside flickered. Elias pushed the door open, stepping into the main hall. Empty pews stretched before him. The air smelled faintly of soil and rot. He called out, "Who's there?" His voice echoed, unanswered, through the hollow sanctuary. The rain grew heavier, drumming like heartbeats. Elias knelt, tracing his fingers along the wooden floor near the confessional, where the voice had come from. The boards were cold, damp. When he pressed his ear against them, he heard it again, faint, muffled sobs rising from below. "Forgive me, Father," the whisper wept. "She won't stop calling my name." Elias staggered back. His candle trembled in his grip, casting twisted shadows on the wall. He wanted to pray, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, he ran to the altar and lifted the old trapdoor beneath it, something he hadn't opened since his ordination. The hinges screamed. A rush of stale air spilled upward, thick with the smell of decay. He descended with the candle shaking before him. The crypt stretched beneath the church, lined with forgotten coffins. In the far corner, a patch of fresh earth stood out from the centuries-old dust. He knelt. The soil was loose, disturbed recently. And then, her hand surfaced. Pale. Small. Unmoving. Elias gasped and dropped the candle. Darkness swallowed the chamber, leaving only the sound of his breath and a faint movement in the dirt. The hand twitched. Slowly, impossibly, fingers curled toward him. The whisper returned, now behind him. She wanted to confess too. Elias turned, but no one stood there. Only the candlelight sputtering back to life, revealing words scratched into the coffin lid beside him, Latin letters etched by desperate fingers. Audavit mortuos. He heard the dead. As the rain finally stopped above, Elias realized something terrifying. The voice that had confessed to him wasn't seeking forgiveness. It was inviting him to listen. Episode 2, The Woman in the Rain. The storm had passed, but the town of St. Matthew still smelled of sorrow. The sea mist lingered like a veil, crawling through the empty streets and wrapping itself around the church's steeple. Father Elias hadn't slept since that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pale hand reaching from the dirt, the way its fingers had trembled toward him as if remembering the warmth of life. He prayed longer than usual that morning, whispering each verse as if it could drown out the echo of that buried confession. Yet even within his prayers, he heard it again, the faint sound of weeping, far away, beneath the church floor. By dusk, the rain returned. Elias stepped outside to light the candles along the entrance when he saw her, a woman in a soaked white dress, standing at the gate. Her hair clung to her face, and her eyes, gray, almost silver, seemed to reflect the candlelight without truly holding it. "Father," her voice was small, trembling. "Will you hear my confession?" He hesitated. The air felt colder around her, as though the storm itself bowed in silence. "Of course, my child," he said, motioning toward the confessional booth. She entered without a sound. When Elias took his seat on the other side, he noticed the smell, salt water and lilies, the scent of old graves near the shore. "What troubles your soul?" he asked softly. "I drowned," she whispered. "But it wasn't the sea that took me. It was faith." Elias froze. "What do you mean?" "I prayed," the woman said, her voice cracking. "When the tide came, I prayed to be saved. But the one who answered wasn't God." Her words melted into sobs. Elias reached for the partition, ready to offer comfort, but when he pushed it open, the booth was empty. The seat was wet, rain pooling where she had knelt. He stood, heart pounding, and stepped outside into the rain. The gate was open. The woman was gone. The next morning, Elias went into the village to ask if anyone had seen her. The fishermen near the shore gave him a long, silent look. Then one of them muttered, "You mean Miriam?" Elias nodded. "She drowned 6 years ago, Father. On a night just like this." He returned to the church in silence. That evening, he found the confessional door ajar again, water dripping from its frame. Inside lay a rosary, corroded by salt and seaweed, resting on the seat where she had knelt. Elias touched it. The beads were ice cold. From somewhere in the distance, the bell tower rang once. Not by wind, nor by hand. And beneath the echo, Elias heard her voice, soft, pleading, rising from the sea itself. "Father, he's listening now." Episode 3, The Candlelight Sermon. That Sunday, the church was fuller than usual. The townsfolk of St. Matthew had begun returning after years of absence, drawn not by faith, but by curiosity. Rumors had spread that Father Elias's sermons could move the dead. He wished it were just a rumor. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, turning the air into a prism of color. Elias stood before the congregation, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. He spoke about forgiveness, how even the damned deserved to be heard. As he raised the chalice, a gust of wind swept through the hall, snuffing out every candle except one, the one on the altar. Its flame burned black. The crowd gasped. Elias froze, staring at it. The air thickened with the scent of iron and smoke. Someone in the pews whispered a prayer under their breath, someone else screamed. But Elias didn't move. He could hear it again, the faint murmur beneath the floorboards. The same voice that had woken him nights ago. "Father," it whispered, slithering up through the cracks. "Do you see us now?" The flame pulsed, dark and hungry. The faces of the saints in the stained glass seemed to warp, their eyes weeping streaks of crimson light. Elias stumbled back, clutching the cross at his neck. "In the name of the Lord, reveal yourself." A shadow rose behind the altar, tall and shivering, like smoke taking form. The parishioners fled, benches clattering, footsteps echoing like thunder, but Elias stayed. He knew running would do no good. The shadow spoke in many voices, layered and broken. "You preach forgiveness, yet you never gave it to us. Who are you?" Elias demanded. "The ones you buried," the voices hissed. "The ones you silenced with prayers instead of mercy." Elias fell to his knees. He could feel them, the souls pressing against the floor beneath him, hundreds of them, whispering through the wood. He thought of the crypt, the graves, the woman in the rain. The dead were gathering. The black flame flared, stretching toward the ceiling. For a moment, it revealed faces, hundreds, screaming in silence within the fire. Then, just as suddenly, the flame collapsed into smoke. When the townspeople returned hours later, they found the church empty. The benches were overturned, the candles melted into rivers of wax. Only the altar remained untouched, its single candle still burning. But it was no longer black. It burned pure white, steady and calm. Father Elias was nowhere to be found. That night, the villagers swore they heard a sermon carried on the wind, a voice echoing from within the sea mist, preaching to no one, over and over. Forgive the dead, before they learn to forgive you. Episode 4, The Choir That Sang Backwards. The next dawn rose gray and lifeless over St. Matthew. The bell tower, still scarred from the storm, loomed like a crooked spine against the sky. Inside the church, the choir children gathered again, their voices soft, uncertain, as if the walls themselves were listening. Father Elias had returned, though no one dared ask where he had gone. His face looked older, his eyes hollow, like a man who'd seen the inside of a dream that wouldn't let him wake. He moved through the aisles in silence, setting candles that refused to stay lit, whispering verses not found in any Bible. By noon, the choir began their practice. The melody should have been bright Ave Maria, but something was wrong. Each note seemed to echo too long, bending and twisting in the air. The children's voices drifted together into an unnatural harmony that made the stained glass tremble. Elias turned, cold sweat breaking along his neck. The hymn was beautiful, but reversed. The Latin syllables unraveled backward, reshaping into words that weren't meant for human tongues. The organist stopped playing first. "Father," she murmured, her hands trembling above the keys. "They're not reading the notes." Elias approached the choir. The children stood still, eyes closed, mouths moving in unison. Their voices deepened, overlapping into something hollow, something far older. Father Elias, the sound whispered through them, a chorus made of one single, impossible voice. "Why did you open the door?" His breath caught. "What door?" "The one beneath the altar." The candles flickered. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards. One of the boys collapsed, convulsing, blood running from his ears. The others kept singing, louder now, their tones spiraling into chaos, melody turning to moan, harmony into lament. Elias shouted, "Stop!" But his voice vanished into the sound. The church shook. From the ceiling, dust fell like ash. Then, as abruptly as it began, the singing stopped. The children opened their eyes, all of them black. In the silence that followed, Elias heard the faint click of the organ playing on its own. The same melody, now in reverse. He ran to it, slamming his hand on the keys. The music stopped, but not the sound. From inside the organ pipes came a whisper, steady, relentless. "She's still singing, beneath." Elias staggered back. He could hear it now, the echo of that backward hymn rising from under the church, from the crypt where the pale hand once reached. That night, the villagers who passed by St. Matthew's swore they heard the children's song again, carried by the wind. It rose, then fell, like waves against stone. But if one listened closely, just closely enough, they'd hear the truth hidden within the reversed words. The choir is not singing for God anymore. Episode 5, The Grave That Wouldn't Stay Closed. The graveyard of St. Matthew's had always been a quiet place, rows of crooked stones leaning into the wind, moss crawling over forgotten names. But now, silence no longer lived there. Every night, Father Elias heard the sound, a dull, rhythmic knock coming from the far corner of the cemetery. Always 3 knocks, then a pause. Then 3 again. At first, he told himself it was the wind, or the sea's distant pulse beneath the cliffs. But one night, when the knocking grew louder, closer, he took his lantern and went to see. The rain had stopped, but the earth was soaked, dark, glistening like open flesh. The fog moved in thick layers, curling around the headstones like smoke from a dying fire. And there, at the edge of the old wall, he saw it, a grave that had sunk inward. The earth had caved, as if something beneath had stirred. The name on the stone was faint, almost erased by time: Joseph Marrow. Died 1897. Elias knelt, touching the wet soil. It trembled beneath his palm, then knocked back. He staggered away, clutching the rosary that hung around his neck. "Lord, deliver this soul," he whispered. But the ground pulsed again, more desperate now. A voice rose from beneath, muffled, cracking through the mud. "Finish the confession." Elias froze. "Who are you?" "The one you buried with sin still in my mouth," the voice rasped. "You heard me once, Father. You stopped listening." The priest's heart pounded. He remembered a name, a fisherman who'd drowned decades ago, whose confession was interrupted by a storm. Joseph Marrow. The last man Elias's predecessor had buried before the plague swept the town. Elias knelt again, trembling. "What is it you seek?" "Forgiveness," the voice whispered, "before he comes for me." Before Elias could answer, the earth split open. Mud burst upward, scattering bones and roots. The coffin lid snapped in two, revealing a body that hadn't decayed, skin pale as wax, eyes open wide, lips moving though no breath came. The corpse's voice seeped out like mist. "Finish what you began." Elias lifted his crucifix, but his words failed him. The dead man's eyes rolled toward the church steeple, then back to Elias. "They're not sleeping anymore, Father. They're waiting for you." Then the body went still. The ground swallowed it once more, sealing itself shut as if nothing had happened. The next morning, when Elias returned, the grave looked untouched, grass-trimmed, soil-firm. Only the headstone had changed. Beneath the name, new words were carved, fresh, raw, as if etched in the night. "Confessed. But not forgiven." And from that day on, the grave never stayed closed. Each night, the soil shifted, opening slightly, as though something beneath still breathed, still waited, for another chance to speak. Episode 6, The Silent Baptism. The church bells tolled softly that morning, each note heavy as if burdened by memory. The mist had crept in from the sea again, filling every corner of St. Matthew's with a damp, ghostly breath. Father Elias stood at the font, the silver bowl before him trembling in his hands. A baptism, the first in months. A sign, he hoped, that faith was returning. The couple entered quietly, pale, frightened people clutching a child wrapped in linen. The baby did not cry. It didn't even stir. Its eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, as if following something that moved just beyond the mortal gaze. "What name have you chosen?" Elias asked, his voice echoing through the hollow church. The mother hesitated. "Gabriel," she said finally. Her tone cracked, like someone reciting a word she'd been forced to remember. Elias nodded and began the rite. He dipped his fingers into the bowl and froze. The water rippled, darkened. A faint shimmer of red spread across its surface. The scent of iron filled the air. "The blood of Christ," Elias murmured, forcing himself to continue. He poured the water over the infant's head. The baby blinked. Then smiled. For a moment, Elias felt peace, a rare warmth blooming in the cold air. But then the child's smile widened, too wide, stretching until it no longer looked human. The candles flickered, their flames bending backward. The church grew silent, save for the low hum beneath the floorboards. The mother gasped, clutching her child. "Father, what's happening?" Elias backed away, heart pounding. "He is not baptized yet." The father stepped forward. Please, finish it." But the water had turned black, bubbling softly. Something moved beneath its surface, like breath trapped beneath glass. The sound of whispering rose, many voices speaking in unison, ancient and broken. Elias stared at the child. Its eyes were glowing faintly, reflecting the same color as the tainted water. He lifted his crucifix. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy." The baby screamed. The sound was not a cry, but a shriek that rattled the windows. The crucifix bent in Elias's hand, the metal warping as if recoiling from the sound. Then, silence. The parents were gone. The church doors hung open, swaying gently. Only the baptismal cloth remained, soaked, crimson, steaming faintly in the cold air. Elias stumbled back, trembling. From within the font, bubbles rose once more. He leaned closer, heart hammering. The reflection staring back at him was not his own. It was the baby, smiling again. And behind it, dozens of pale faces, floating just beneath the surface of the water. That night, when Elias returned to the font, the water was clear again. Still. Holy. But carved into the marble edge were words that hadn't been there before, words written in a hand not his own. One baptism. Many souls. Episode 7, The Confession of the Dead Nun. The next evening, St. Matthew's Church was drowning in silence. The air was so still that even the candles refused to flicker. Father Elias sat in the pews, head bowed, hands clasped tight as if he feared what might move should he let go. Sleep had abandoned him long ago, prayer had started to sound like begging. He wasn't alone. It began with the faint sound of rosary beads clicking, slow, deliberate, somewhere behind him. He turned, expecting the caretaker. But no one stood there. Only the shadows stretched long across the stone floor, their edges shivering with each heartbeat. Then came the scent, old incense and dried flowers. The smell of a convent long abandoned. From the back of the church, a figure stepped forward. Her habit was torn and faded, soaked with something dark at the hem. A crucifix hung around her neck, its chain broken, swinging gently with each step. "Peace be with you," Elias whispered, though his voice trembled. The woman stopped halfway down the aisle. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "I came to confess, Father," she said. Elias's throat tightened. "When did you last make confession, my child?" She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't belong to the living. "When I still had a tongue." The words sank into him like ice. He rose slowly, gesturing toward the confessional, but she shook her head. "No need for walls, Father. He already heard me once." "He?" Elias asked. The nun tilted her head, and for a moment, he saw the wound, a deep gash across her throat, pale and old. "The one beneath your church. The one you call Lord." Elias stepped back. "Blasphemy." "Truth," she whispered, kneeling in the aisle. "We prayed for miracles." "We thought," he answered. "But miracles are bargains, Father. And I was the offering." The candles sputtered. Shadows crawled up the walls like black vines. "I begged him to speak to me," she continued, her voice cracking. "And when he did, his voice was not from heaven. It came from below the altar." Elias could barely breathe. "What did he say?" She lifted her gaze to meet his. "That he was lonely." Then she smiled again, wider this time, and the church filled with the sound of dozens of rosaries, rattling all at once. From the rafters, faint shapes began to appear, silhouettes of veiled women, kneeling, whispering, weeping. The dead sisters of St. Verena's convent, long buried beneath the chapel. Elias fell to his knees. "What do you want from me?" The nun reached out, her hand cold as marble, resting on his chest. "To finish what we started. To free him." The candles went out. Only the moonlight remained, trembling on the stone floor like spilled water. When morning came, the parishioners found the church empty, except for a single rosary laid across the altar, each bead cracked in half. And on the wall behind it, written in ashes, "She confessed for us all." Episode 8, The Bell That Rang at Midnight. The villagers of St. Matthew had learned to avoid the church after sunset. Its steeple loomed like a broken finger pointing at the heavens, its bell silent for years. But that night, at exactly midnight, the silence shattered. Father Elias woke to the sound of the bell tolling once, twice, 12 times. Each strike echoed through his bones, vibrating the air like a heartbeat too large for the earth. He stumbled out of bed, half believing it a dream, until the final toll faded into something else, whispers. He hurried through the dark corridor, lantern shaking in his hand. The church doors stood open though he'd locked them hours before. The wind pushed at him as he stepped inside, bringing with it the smell of rain and rusted metal. The bell rope hung motionless. Yet the sound still rolled through the steeple. He looked up. High above, in the tower's shadows, a shape was moving, slow, rhythmic, like someone swinging the rope unseen. "Who's there?" he shouted. A pause. Then a voice drifted down, faint, almost gentle. "You called us, Father." The lantern flickered. Elias gripped the crucifix beneath his robe. "Who speaks?" The voice laughed softly. "You did, when you blessed the blood." He thought of the baptism. The red water. The silent child. His stomach turned cold. "What do you want?" "To be heard." The bell rang again, a single, mournful toll. The air shook. Elias saw them now, forming out of the darkness, faint outlines of people, dozens of them, standing in the aisles, their faces half-formed, their mouths open in voiceless prayer. Each time the bell struck, one of them turned to look at him. He backed toward the altar, but the floorboards creaked under his feet like breath. The voices grew louder, all whispering the same words, over and over. 12 souls. 12 tolls. He looked up at the clock above the entrance. It was frozen midnight, forever. Elias ran for the bell tower steps. The climb felt endless, the spiral of stone winding higher and higher, the sound pressing in from every side. When he reached the top, his lantern blew out. The moonlight cut through the slats, silver and trembling. The bell hung there unmoving. But beneath it, something was carved into the metal, glowing faintly in the dark. Names. 12 names. He traced them with his fingers. Each one belonged to a villager who had died that year. And at the bottom, a 13th name waited, freshly etched, unfinished. Father Elias Marrow. The wind rose, and the bell swung on its own, slow and heavy. The last toll thundered through the night, shaking the steeple. Elias fell to his knees, covering his ears as the sound turned into voices, screams, laughter, prayer, all at once. When it finally stopped, the town below was silent again. The bell tower stood still. But when the villagers awoke the next morning, they found the bell lying shattered in the churchyard, and beside it, a trail of wet footprints leading from the tower to the sea. No one ever saw Father Elias again. But every midnight since, when the tide is high, the bell rings once more, just one mournful toll, and a whisper drifts across the waves. The 13th soul is still listening. Episode 9, The Book of Unwritten Sins. The bell no longer rang, but the echoes of its final toll haunted St. Matthew like a curse. The church stood half empty now, the pews coated in dust, the air thick with the smell of salt and something older, parchment, perhaps, or decay.
Father Elias had not been seen since that dreadful night. Yet somehow, the candles still lit themselves before dawn.
One morning, when the caretaker entered to clean, he found a book resting on the altar, one that had never been there before. Its cover was bound in blackened leather, cracked and warm to the touch, though no flame burned near it. On its spine was a single word, etched in gold that shimmered like wet blood, Absolvo.
The caretaker opened it.
Every page was blank. At least, until he whispered the name, Father Elias. Then ink bled through the paper, shaping letters one by one, as though written by an unseen hand. He heard the confessions of the dead. But who will hear his? Terrified, the man shut the book and brought it to the bishop in the nearby city. The bishop, a stern man of faith hardened by miracles and madness alike, dismissed it as blasphemy. Yet that night, he too opened the book and found not blank pages, but names.
Hundreds of them. Some ancient, some new. Names of sinners and saints, written in a language that seemed to move even when the eye looked away.
Then he found his own. It glowed faintly, followed by words that chilled him to the marrow, confession due. He tried to burn the book, but it would not catch fire. He tried to drown it, but the pages remained dry. In desperation, he sent it back to St. Matthew's, sealed in a silver box. But when the carriage arrived, the box was empty. Weeks passed before anyone dared step foot inside the church again. When they did, they found Father Elias seated at the altar, pale, trembling, eyes sunken as though he'd never stopped praying. The book lay open before him. "Father," a voice whispered from the pews. "What are you reading?" Elias did not answer at first. His hand shook as he traced the newest line of ink. "It writes itself," he murmured. "Every sin unspoken. Every secret untold. It remembers." He turned the page. There, at the bottom, a new entry began to form in real time, the words bleeding through the fibers like veins. "He who reads becomes the witness. He who witnesses must confess." The air grew colder. The candles flickered out one by one until only the book's crimson glow remained. Elias looked up, his face half lit by its light. "Do you hear them?" he asked softly. "They're writing even now." The caretaker stepped closer, just enough to see what filled the next page. His breath caught. It was his name, freshly written. Beneath it, in trembling script, "Confession received. Soul pending." And before he could speak, the church doors slammed shut. The sound of scratching filled the darkness, the pages turning on their own, faster, faster, as if eager to record more sins, eager to remember what even God had forgotten. When dawn broke, the book was gone. But on the altar's stone surface, burned deep into the marble, was a single line that no one could erase. Absolution has a price. Episode 10, The Miracle That Wasn't. The town of St. Matthew whispered again, not of ghosts, but of a miracle. It began with a boy named Tomas, blind since birth. His mother had brought him to the church steps one morning, her knees raw from the stones where she'd been praying outside. She claimed she'd heard Father Elias's voice calling from within the chapel, though the doors had been locked for months. "Bring the boy," the voice had said. "Let him see what others will not." When she entered, the church was dark. The air felt heavy, pulsing with something that was almost alive. At the altar stood Father Elias, thinner than before, his eyes dim yet burning with a strange, inward light. In his hand, he held the book of unwritten sins. "Do you still believe in miracles?" he asked the woman. "I believe in mercy," she whispered. "Please, my son cannot see." Elias opened the book.
The pages fluttered like wings, stopping on one that shimmered faintly.
He dipped his fingers into a bowl of water beside the altar. It glowed, faint red at first, then clear again. "In the name of the one who hears all," he murmured, touching the boy's eyelids, "let the veil be lifted." For a moment, the church fell silent. Then the boy gasped. His eyes opened wide, golden, trembling with light. "Mother," he whispered.
"I can see." Tears broke from her.
She fell to the floor, praising God, clutching Elias's hands. But the priest did not smile. His face was pale, drained, as though something vital had just been taken from him. Then the boy's voice changed. "Father," he said softly, turning toward Elias, "why are they all screaming?" Elias froze. "Who?" "The people," Tomas said, pointing toward the empty pews. "They're on fire." The mother turned, horrified. There was nothing there, only empty seats. But the boy began to cry, clutching his eyes. "They won't stop burning. They're all looking at me." The candles burst into flame, their wax running black. The book of unwritten sins slammed shut on the altar. Elias rushed to the boy, but when he tried to touch him, the child recoiled, shrieking. "It's you," Tomas sobbed. "You're the brightest of them all." Then his eyes rolled white, and he collapsed. The mother screamed, but Elias could only stare, for written across the boy's eyelids, faint and red, were words that hadn't been there before. Vision granted. Innocence revoked. When the mother looked again, the boy was breathing, but his eyes were gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken skin. That night, Elias buried the bowl of holy water behind the church and locked the book away in the crypt. But long after midnight, as the tide whispered against the shore, he heard a child's voice outside his window, calm, distant, and wrong. "Father," it said, "they all see now." And somewhere deep beneath the church, something began to laugh, slow, deliberate, echoing off the stone walls like the tolling of a bell. Episode 11, The Saint Without Eyes. The statue had always stood at the far end of St. Matthew's nave, St. Lucia, the patron of light and vision. Her marble face serene, her eyes lifted toward heaven, forever carved in prayer. But when Father Elias returned from the crypt one dawn, the saint's gaze was gone. The sockets were empty. Not hollowed by time or vandals, but sealed over, smooth as candle wax, as though heaven itself had taken back her sight. Elias stood before her, heart pounding. The air smelled faintly of salt and something sweet, incense, or rot. He reached out, tracing the smooth stone where eyes once were. It was warm. From somewhere deep in the church, a bell clanged once. Not the old tower bell, this sound came from beneath the floor. He turned, lantern trembling in his hand, and saw it, a trail of moisture leading from the altar to the statue's feet. It glistened red under the flickering light. He dipped his fingers into it. It was thick, metallic blood. Then the statue began to weep. From the sealed sockets, dark tears spilled, streaking down the saint's pale cheeks. The drops hissed as they touched the floor, leaving black stains in the stone. Elias fell to his knees. "Mother of mercy." The candles went out. When he looked up again, the statue's face had changed. Her lips were parted now, her expression almost human. In the silence, a whisper crawled through the church, soft, broken, yet unmistakably clear. "Elias, return what you took." He froze. "Who speaks?" The whisper came from the statue itself. "The eyes. You took what was not yours to see." The lantern flickered violently. Shadows slithered along the walls, twisting, reaching, forming shapes of faceless figures kneeling in the pews. The air filled with the sound of quiet sobbing. Elias clutched his crucifix.
In the name of the Lord, reveal your intent."
The sobbing stopped.
Then, from the darkness, dozens of whispering voices answered at once.
"He is not the Lord."
The church shook. The stained glass shattered inward, scattering color across the floor.
Elias stumbled back, bleeding from shallow cuts. He stared at the statue again, St. Lucia's face now split in half, her mouth gaping wide, and from within it something gleamed.
A pair of human eyes. They blinked.
Elias screamed and fell backward. The eyes rolled toward him, their pupils pale gold, the same color as Tomas's had been before they vanished. As he fled the church, the bell beneath the floor tolled once more, deep and hollow. The next morning, the villagers found the statue restored, her face peaceful again, her eyes returned.
But they were wrong.
They were not carved of marble anymore. They were real. And if one stood close enough, one could see that they moved, following whoever dared look too long.
That night, a new engraving appeared on the altar, faintly carved by something unseen.
"The blind shall see."
But not what they hoped for. Episode 12, The Confessional That Bled.
The storm returned that night, rolling in from the sea like an old memory. The wind screamed against the church windows, and every door in St. Matthew's rattled as though begging to be opened. Father Elias sat alone in the dark, the rosary trembling in his hands. He had locked the book of unwritten sins in the crypt, sealed the font, and covered the statue of St. Lucia with a shroud, yet the whispers had only grown louder. They no longer came from beneath the church.
They came from within it.
At first, he thought it was the wind. But then he heard the voices, hundreds of them, murmuring from the confessional.
They spoke not in words but in breaths, soft exhalations that formed sentences between heartbeats.
"Forgive me, Father, for I have not sinned."
Elias froze.
The sound came from the right-hand booth, the one he'd boarded shut after the last haunting. Slowly, he rose, lantern in hand.
The wood was trembling as if something inside was breathing.
"Who's there?" he whispered.
A pause. Then, "You."
He felt his pulse spike. The voice was not human. It was his own, distorted, echoing back from behind the screen.
"Open it," it said. Elias stepped closer. The boards creaked beneath his feet. The smell hit him first: iron, salt, decay. He lifted the lantern.
A thin red line was seeping from the seams of the confessional door, winding down the wood and pooling at his feet.
Blood.
"Lord, protect." The door shuddered violently.
Something pounded from inside. Once. Twice. Then silence. He took a step back. The blood trail thickened, spreading like veins across the floor. He watched in horror as words began to form, written in the flowing red.
"You heard us die."
The confessional burst open.
The lantern fell, its light swinging wildly as Elias stumbled. Inside, the booth was empty, no body, no shadow, only a single object resting on the seat, a chalice filled to the brim with blood.
Elias knelt, trembling.
Beneath the chalice, a page had been torn from the book. The ink was still wet, the words pulsing faintly as though alive.
Every sin confessed becomes a voice.
Every voice requires a mouth. He lifted the page and heard the whispers again, now rising from all around him. The walls seemed to breathe, the pews shifting with unseen weight. From behind him came a sound like wood splitting. He turned. The left-hand confessional, the one that had always stood empty, now had someone inside. He could see a silhouette through the screen. "Forgive me, Father," the voice rasped, soft and familiar.
Elias's throat tightened.
"Who are you?" The figure leaned closer. Through the mesh, he saw a face pale, blood-streaked, his own.
The lantern went out.
When the villagers entered the church at dawn, they found both booths drenched in crimson. The confessional walls pulsed faintly, as if something beneath the wood still lived. And carved into the seat, in letters burned black, was a final message. His blood speaks for us now.
Episode 13, The Visit from the Cardinal.
By the time the carriage reached St. Matthew's, dawn had turned the sea gray and sickly. The man who stepped out wore crimson robes heavy with rain, his ring glinting like a drop of blood. Cardinal Severin had come from Rome, summoned by silence. The Vatican had received no word from Father Elias in months. Whispers of heresy and miracles had reached their ears, wrapped in salt and fear. The cardinal expected a ruined church, perhaps an unhinged priest. But what he found was worse: the church was breathing. When Severin entered, the air itself seemed to exhale. Dust fell like ash from the rafters. Candles flickered to life on their own. The confessional, now boarded with chains, trembled faintly as though something inside stirred at his presence. He crossed himself and called out, "Father Elias?" A figure emerged from the shadows behind the altar. The priest's cassock hung loose on his thin frame, his eyes sunken but bright, too bright.
"Your Eminence," Elias said softly. "You've come to confess, then?"
The cardinal stiffened. "You sent for us, not the other way around."
Elias smiled. "Did I?
Or did the book?"
Severin frowned.
"You speak of the relic you wrote about Absolvo. Where is it?"
Elias turned toward the altar.
A silver chest sat there, sealed in wax, its surface pulsing like something alive beneath. "It writes what heaven forgets," he whispered. "It keeps what God refuses to hear."
Severin stepped closer. "Blasphemy." "No, Eminence," Elias said.
"Truth."
He opened the chest.
The book of unwritten sins lay inside, its pages fluttering though there was no wind.
One page glowed faintly. Severin leaned in and froze.
His own name was written there, Cardinal Marcus Severin. Beneath it, the words, "The shepherd who traded prayer for silence." His breath hitched. "Who dares?"
"The dead, Your Eminence," Elias interrupted. "They write faster than I can read." The candles burst, sending sparks into the air.
The church groaned like something waking from sleep. Elias's voice deepened, layered, no longer his alone. "They demand their confessor.
They demand you." Severin stepped back.
"You are possessed."
"Possession," Elias whispered, "is just faith that's been answered too loudly." The walls bled.
Lines of crimson dripped between the stones, forming Latin phrases that no one had spoken in centuries. "Venit redemptio per poenitentiam mortuorum."
Salvation comes through the penance of the dead. Severin tried to flee, but the doors slammed shut. From the confessional came the sound of breathing, then hundreds of voices whispering at once, "Confess, confess, confess." He fell to his knees. "What do you want?" Elias's eyes turned white.
"Your truth." The cardinal screamed a raw, broken sound swallowed by the wind. When the villagers entered the next morning, the church was empty again. The crimson robes of the cardinal lay folded on the altar, soaked through. The book of unwritten sins was open beside them. A new line had been written during the night, still glistening wet. He came to judge the heretic. He left forgiven by the dead. Episode 14, The Forgotten Sermon. The sea had turned black that week, a sheet of mirrorless glass stretching to the horizon. The villagers said it was a sign that the church had lost its reflection. Father Elias, gaunt and sleepless, could no longer tell where his prayers ended and the whispers began. Every night he dreamed the same dream, himself standing at the pulpit, delivering a sermon to a congregation of shadows. He would wake to the echo of his own voice, words he didn't remember speaking, sentences too old to belong to him. On the seventh night, he found proof it wasn't a dream. The old caretaker, pale as parchment, brought him a recording, a dusty reel-to-reel found beneath the choir loft. It played on its own. "Father," the man whispered. "At midnight. You should hear it." Elias stared at the tape. His fingers shook as he threaded it into the player. When the reel turned, the church filled with static, and then, unmistakably, his voice. "Brothers and sisters," it said, smooth and steady, "we gather not to praise God, but to remind Him." Elias's blood ran cold. The voice continued, "We are the bridge between the living and the dead. Each confession builds the path. Each prayer drives the nail." He pressed stop. The silence roared around him. He didn't remember saying those words. Yet he could hear himself breathing on the tape, calm, certain, holy. The caretaker took a step back. "Father, this recording was dated 15 years ago. Before you came to St. Matthew's." Elias looked up sharply. "That's impossible." The man nodded toward the window. "Then how do you explain this?" Outside, the entire village stood in the rain, facing the church, hundreds of them, silent, eyes wide open. Every one of them was murmuring the same thing, over and over, lips moving in rhythm with the wind. The exact words from the recording. "We gather not to praise God, but to remind Him." Elias ran to the altar, clutching the book of unwritten sins. The pages turned on their own, stopping on a blank one that began to write itself in red ink. The sermon has begun. The church doors swung open. Rain poured in, extinguishing every candle. Elias heard footsteps, dozens of them entering the nave, wet and heavy. "Who are you?" he demanded. A voice, perfectly matching his own, answered from the pulpit, the preacher who never stopped. The light flickered, and there he was, another Father Elias standing before the congregation, identical down to the trembling hands. The doppelganger raised a finger to his lips. "Shoo! You'll make him forget again." Elias's voice cracked. "Make who forget what?" The double smiled, cold, knowing. "That he was once human." And as the crowd began to chant, the real Elias fell to his knees, his ears bleeding from the noise, realizing too late that his sermon was not being recorded this time. It was being rewritten. When the storm ended, the villagers vanished. Only the tape remained, still playing softly, his voice looping endlessly. "We gather not to praise God, but to remind Him." Episode 15, The Child in the Mirror. For the first time in months, St. Matthew's Church lay quiet. The storms had stopped, the sea was still, and Father Elias almost believed that silence meant peace. But peace is only the space between hauntings. That morning, a child appeared at the chapel door, barefoot, drenched, no older than 7. His eyes were too familiar. The same pale gold that Elias had seen once before, in a boy who'd been granted sight by blood. The child said nothing, only pointed toward the font where the baptismal water had long since dried. Elias hesitated, then followed. Inside the basin was a thin layer of condensation, enough to catch his reflection. Except it wasn't his reflection. The face that looked back was him as a child, eyes wide, lips trembling, the faint trace of fear frozen into memory. Elias staggered backward. "No, that's not possible." The boy at the door smiled. "You remember now. Who are you?" Elias demanded. "I'm what you left behind," the child said. "The part you buried when you chose to hear the dead." The air grew heavy. The mirrors of the church, small, decorative relics near the confessionals, began to hum. Their glass rippled like water. And in each one, Elias saw versions of himself, praying, screaming, preaching to empty pews. Every reflection moved a heartbeat slower than he did, as if time itself had to catch up. The child stepped closer.
"Do you know what you confessed when you were my age?" Elias shook his head. "You told him you wanted to hear his voice. You just didn't ask which voice it would be."
The reflection smiled, not Elias, not the child, but something in between. Its eyes were black pits now, filled with whispering faces that pressed against the glass from the other side.
"Stop," Elias pleaded. "You're not real."
The child tilted his head.
"Then why do you remember me?"
The mirrors cracked in unison. From every splinter, blood began to seep, running in thin streams down the walls. Elias fell to his knees as the sound of countless children's laughter echoed through the nave, high, cold, endless. The boy's voice cut through it all.
"He's still listening, Father." He never stopped. Elias looked up.
The child was gone. Only the mirror remained, a single shard on the floor, glinting in the dim light.
He reached for it, trembling.
In its reflection, his adult face was gone. A child stared back, silent, frightened, holding a crucifix far too large for his hands. When the villagers found him the next morning, Father Elias was kneeling before the altar, smiling faintly, eyes distant. Around him lay dozens of shattered mirrors, each one reflecting something different: a child, a priest, a corpse, and something else behind them all, watching. On the wall above him, scratched deep into the plaster, was a final message written backward, only legible when seen in glass. "He who hears the dead must first remember being one." Episode 16, The Town That Never Prayed. By the time winter fell upon St. Matthew, prayer had become a forgotten language. The villagers no longer crossed themselves when they passed the church. The bells had long been silent, and every window was nailed shut, as though the wind itself carried sin. Father Elias wandered the streets each night, his cassock dragging through puddles of black rain. He no longer recognized the town he served. The houses seemed to lean inward, whispering to each other when the fog rolled in. And when he called out for God, the echo that returned was always his own voice, one syllable short. Then the dreams began. Each night, he saw the same image, the entire village kneeling before the church, mouths open, praying soundlessly to the sea. And from the water rose hands, hundreds of them, made of salt and bone, reaching, blessing, pulling the faithful under. When he woke, he heard the same rhythm outside, a wet, deliberate knocking. He followed it one night, lantern in hand, down to the shoreline. The tide had retreated far beyond its usual reach, revealing the skeletal foundations of the old town, St. Matthew's original church, swallowed by the sea centuries ago. At its center stood a broken altar. Upon it, a single candle burned in defiance of the wind. Elias stepped closer, his breath shallow. The candle's flame bent toward him, whispering in a voice not his own. Faithless, yet chosen. He fell to his knees. Around him, the earth pulsed, soft, hollow, as if breathing. Then he heard it, the town behind him, murmuring in unison. He turned. The villagers had followed, standing in the shallows, their eyes white and unblinking. None of them moved. None of them breathed. Yet their lips formed the same words again and again. "We are the prayer now." Elias stumbled backward as the tide rushed in, faster than any wave should move. The villagers didn't flinch as it swallowed them. Their bodies sank beneath the surface, vanishing into the black water, one by one. When the last ripple faded, only silence remained. He turned toward the old altar, but the candle was gone. In its place lay the book of unwritten sins, half buried in wet sand. It was open to a blank page that began to fill as he watched, ink blooming like blood. They prayed until he listened. Then he demanded silence. The wind howled, carrying a faint chorus of voices, the same villagers, singing now beneath the waves, their hymn rising and falling with the tide. Elias stood there until dawn, salt stinging his eyes, the sea calm once more. He whispered a prayer, not for them, but for himself. When he opened his eyes, the village was gone. Only the church remained, alone on an empty shore. And in the distance, where the water met the fog, he thought he saw them still kneeling, white shapes swaying with the current, praying to something that no longer needed to be worshipped. The town that forgot to pray, Elias murmured, has finally been heard. Episode 17, The Crucifix That Turned Away. The crucifix above the altar had hung there for centuries, its wood blackened by smoke, its Christ worn smooth by countless prayers. It had survived storms, fire, and the silence of the dead. But one morning, as Father Elias entered to prepare the Mass, he saw it facing the wrong way. Christ's figure had turned toward the wall. He froze, the cold seeping into his bones. He thought perhaps the wood had loosened, or that the night wind had twisted the cross. But when he stepped closer, he saw the nail holes. They were on the opposite side now, as if the crucifix had decided to turn its back. A faint smell of salt drifted from the altar, not holy oil, not incense. The smell of the sea. Elias whispered a prayer, voice trembling. "Why do you hide from me?" A gust of wind extinguished every candle at once. From the darkness came a whisper, familiar yet strange, layered like a choir in reverse, because you have begun to look where angels close their eyes. The shadows thickened. He lifted his lantern. Its flame wavered, and for an instant, he saw shapes, silhouettes kneeling in the pews, headless, motionless, all facing the altar. He called out, "Show yourself." The church answered with a single sound, the slow creak of wood. The crucifix was turning again. Elias stumbled backward as the figure of Christ twisted, not as wood, but as flesh. Its head turned first, eyes hollow, and weeping black resin. Then its lips moved. "Do you still believe, Elias?" His throat closed. "Yes," he managed. "Even now." The crucifix smiled. "Then believe in this." The walls began to bleed. Thin streams ran down the painted saints, their faces melting into anguish. The floor rippled beneath him like shallow water. Elias fell to his knees, clutching the book of unwritten sins, though its pages burned in his hands. The voice deepened, the Christ, the dead, the sea, all speaking as one, "You were chosen to hear us, not to save us. We have no need for redemption. Only remembrance." The cross rotated fully now, its back against the wall again, but the figure was gone. In its place, scorched into the wood, were words that glowed like embers. He turned away first. Elias felt something warm drip onto his cheek. He looked up. Blood was falling from the ceiling, drop by drop, forming a ring around him. Then the church doors blew open. The sea wind howled through, carrying with it faint echoes, the cries of the drowned, the chant of the forgotten. The crucifix fell from the wall and shattered at his feet. When the villagers came the next day, they found Father Elias still kneeling at the altar, his eyes wide open, his hands pressed together in prayer. But his head was bowed, not in devotion, but as if something above had forced it down. And behind him, the wall where the crucifix once hung now bore a faint handprint, larger than any human's, pressed deep into the stone, fingers reaching away from heaven. Episode 18, The Night of False Resurrection. It began at midnight, the hour when St. Matthew's graveyard usually whispered but never spoke. This time, it sang. Father Elias heard it from his cell, a low, rhythmic hum, deep and distant, like voices trapped beneath the earth. He rushed outside, the lantern quivering in his grip, wind slicing through the mist.
The night smelled of rain and decay.
The moon was hidden behind clouds, but something else glowed, the graves. One by one, the crosses began to tilt, soil shifting, lids creaking open.
Elias stumbled forward, heart pounding.
The earth itself was moving, breathing. And then, the first hand broke through the dirt.
Pale, thin, shaking.
He fell to his knees.
Merciful God!
The dead rose. Not all at once, but in slow, sullen rhythm, as if answering an ancient hymn. Men, women, children, their faces wet with soil and something darker, their eyes bright with recognition.
They weren't grotesque. They weren't lost.
They were awake. "Father," one whispered, a woman whose face he half remembered from a long-ago funeral. "We have finished our penance."
Elias backed away. You should not be here."
Another voice, this one a child's, echoed from behind him.
"You told us to confess, Father."
"We did." Everywhere he turned, more emerged, dozens, hundreds, walking toward the church, their bare feet soundless on the wet ground. The bell tower shook as if from within, and the church doors flew open, slamming against the walls. They entered as a congregation.
Elias followed, unable to stop himself. Inside, the candles lit on their own.
The crucifix was gone, replaced by a black void where it once hung. The pews filled with the dead, faces turned toward the altar. At the pulpit, a voice began to speak.
Not Elias's. Not human. "Rise, my children," it said. "You have confessed. You are cleansed."
Elias turned toward the sound and saw himself standing at the altar, radiant and still, but with eyes that glowed red like embers. His other self raised a hand.
"And now, Father, it is your turn to die."
The dead repeated the word, "Die, die, die," their voices joining in harmony, like a choir of hollow lungs.
Elias screamed. The lantern shattered. Shadows leapt up the walls.
The false priest stepped closer, his smile stretching unnaturally.
"You prayed for resurrection. But resurrection was never for the living."
The crowd of the dead began to kneel, folding their hands in worship not to God, but to the mockery wearing Elias's face. And as he fell backward, struck blind by the light pouring from the altar, he heard them all whisper together. The living must confess to the dead. When morning came, the church was silent again. Every grave in the cemetery stood open empty. And at the altar lay a single thing, Father Elias's cassock, folded neatly, still warm, with soil clinging to its sleeves, as if he'd just climbed out from beneath the earth.
Episode 19, The Confession of God. For 3 nights, St. Matthew's stood in perfect silence. No wind. No tide. No heartbeat in the earth.
The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting.
Father Elias no longer slept.
His eyes were dry and hollow, his hands raw from prayer. He had buried his voice in endless psalms, but still the silence answered back. On the 4th night, it changed. It spoke. It began as a whisper, soft, endless, like wind through leaves that no longer existed. Then came the words, clear as bells in his skull.
Elias.
He froze. The sound came from everywhere, from the stone, the sea, the air inside his lungs. "Who are you?" he whispered.
A pause. Then, calmly, "You asked to hear me." Elias fell to his knees, trembling. You are the Lord? I am what remains when the Lord has been forgotten."
The voice echoed like the sea folding over itself.
The candles flared, burning blue.
Shadows formed along the walls, crawling upward, taking on familiar shapes: the dead, the children, the drowned, the faceless. Elias pressed his palms together.
"What do you want from me?"
"I have wanted nothing for 1,000 years," the voice said, almost weary.
"Until you began to listen." The ground shook.
From the cracks beneath the altar seeped light, not divine, but feverish, pulsing like a living wound. "You have built a bridge between worlds," it continued.
"And bridges must be crossed."
Elias clutched the crucifix at his chest. "If you are God, show mercy."
The voice laughed, low and endless. "Mercy was my first sin."
The church trembled. The pews burst into flame without heat or smoke. Every mirror, every shard of glass reflected not Elias but something vast, a human form woven from stars and darkness, weeping tears of light that burned holes in the floor.
The voice softened. "You prayed for me to speak."
"But words are not love, Elias.
Words are hunger." Elias screamed, "Then what am I to you?" The figure stepped closer, unseen yet overwhelming, its shadow consuming the entire nave. "My confessor."
And then, for the first time in his life, Elias heard God weep. Each tear that fell became a voice, hundreds, thousands, whispering at once, the prayers of the forgotten, the condemned, the angels who had lost their names. "I sinned first," the voice said.
"And I need to be forgiven." The candles went out.
The church was swallowed in black. Elias felt a hand, vast, invisible, press against his head. His mind flooded with every death, every plea, every unanswered prayer ever spoken. He whispered, broken, "I absolve you." The air shattered. A sound like thunder and screaming oceans filled the night. The crucifix reappeared above the altar, but the figure of Christ was gone. When morning came, the church was ash and salt. Only one wall still stood, bearing words written in gold and blood. "Even God must confess." And far out on the horizon, the sea parted for a moment as though something immense had finally risen to breathe. Episode 20, The Priest Who Heard No More.
The sea was silent again. Too silent.
It stretched like a mirror of obsidian beneath a colorless sky, and where St. Matthew once stood, only ruins remained, bones of a church rising from salt and fog. They found Father Elias 3 days after the storm, kneeling in the ashes of the altar. His eyes were open, his lips curved in a faint, peaceful smile, though his body was cold. Around him, the remnants of candles still burned, their flames unwavering despite the wind. The villagers who dared approach swore they heard something faint, not words, not prayer, but the echo of breathing from the earth beneath his feet. On the altar before him lay a new confessional, freshly built from blackened wood. No one in the town claimed to have crafted it. No one had tools sharp enough to carve the symbols that ran along its edges, symbols older than Latin, glowing faintly like veins beneath skin. When they tried to move the priest's body, the ground refused to yield. It was as if he were part of the stone itself, rooted there by something unseen. A villager whispered a prayer. The others did not. At sunset, the wind began to rise. The sea shimmered with light that wasn't sunlight. From beneath the ruins, a voice began to murmur, soft, rhythmic, familiar. It was Father Elias. But his mouth did not move. "The bridge is built," his voice whispered through the air. "The living have confessed. The dead have been heard. Now silence must rule." The villagers fled. But some turned back just before reaching the cliffs, and what they saw burned itself into the memory of St. Matthew forever. The confessional door creaked open. From within poured a faint light, gold at first, then red, then something colorless, like the hue of sound. A shadow stepped out, tall, featureless, carrying a book that seemed to breathe.
Its pages turned without hands, ink blooming into new words faster than the eye could follow.
It stopped beside Elias's body, touched his forehead, and the priest's eyes finally closed. The voice spoke one last time, not his, not human, yet filled with something heartbreakingly gentle. He heard the dead until they learned to speak. He spoke until heaven forgot the difference. Then the light vanished. The sea swallowed the ruins whole, dragging the church, the confessional, and Father Elias into its depths. The waves sealed over as if nothing had ever stood there. Years passed. Fishermen say that on certain nights, when the tide pulls too far back, a bell can still be heard beneath the water. And if one listens closely, if one dares, they can make out a voice between the tolls, patient and endless, whispering the same prayer. "Forgive me, Father, for I have finally been heard."
And the sea answers with silence.
Epilogue: The Silence of St. Matthew. Decades passed before the church dared speak the name St. Matthew again. The coastal town vanished from maps, its coordinates erased from Vatican archives under a simple phrase stamped in red, "Site condemned, de profundis." Yet sailors still told stories. Some claimed that when storms brewed over that stretch of sea, a bell would ring beneath the waves, one slow toll, like a heartbeat calling from the deep. Others swore they saw faint candlelight shimmering below the surface, as if a cathedral still stood there, intact and alive. In 1983, a team of marine archaeologists diving near the ruins recovered a single object, a sealed wooden box, preserved against all decay. Inside, they found a fragment of a blackened book. Most of its pages were blank, but one remained untouched by time, inked in red so dark it shimmered. It read, "Absolution achieved. Transmission complete. The priest hears no more." The Vatican confiscated the relic within hours. The divers were ordered to silence. But one, before disappearing, told his wife that the water had whispered his name as he surfaced, not from behind him, but from inside his own breathing. Now, when the tide falls low and the wind is still, fishermen say you can hear it again, that low, aching whisper beneath the waves. "Forgive me, Father." No one answers anymore. Because the one who could, the priest who heard the dead, has become the silence himself.